you for joining us tonight. We welcome Texas Tech University professor, Dr. Catharine Franklin, as part of our Arts and Culture series. I'm Claire Noble, the program manager for the Vail Symposium. On behalf of Chris Sable, our executive director, Dale Mosier, our board chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium board, welcome. For nearly 50 years, the Vail Symposium has been providing the Vail community with thought-provoking, affordable programming. A few notes before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an option for Q&A, and that's how you'll share your questions with our speaker. I'll monitor the Q&A and share those questions with our speaker later in the program. We'll try to get to as many as time permits. Tonight's program runs until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take a moment to thank a few of the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, the Antlers at Vail, and the Vail Daily. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Our summer season has been underwritten by Cindy Ingalls and Leela and Walt Mischer. And the Vail Symposium is supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Funding has also been provided to the Vail Symposium by Colorado Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, Economic Stabilization Plan of 2020. If you're a Vail Symposium donor, thank you so much. If you're not but would like to be, please visit vailsymposium.org. I hope you'll join us later this week on Thursday, October 1st. We welcome Cindy Dale as part of our Consciousness series. I also wanted to give you a heads up about a program coming up next week on Thursday, October 8th. We take on Proposition 114, the reintroduction of the gray wolf to Colorado. Joining us will be wildlife biologist and Montana State Senator Mike Phillips and Vice President for Advocacy of the Colorado Farm Bureau, Sean Martini. Moderating will be Rob Levine. Tonight, we're honored to have with us Dr. Catharine Franklin. Dr. Franklin specializes in the history of the 19th century United States Army with an emphasis on Indigenous peoples and the American West in the post-Civil War era. Her research and teaching interests lie in 19th century American history, military history, Indigenous history, and the history of the American West and borderlands. Her book manuscript, The Army Stands Between, Soldiers and Indians in the West, upends the story of the so-called Indian Wars. Dr. Franklin has written award-winning journal articles for Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. Dr. Franklin earned a BA in English Literature and American Studies from the City College of New York, and an MA and PhD in History at the University of Oklahoma. She has received short-term fellowships from the United States Army Center of Military History, the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, and the Newberry Library in Chicago, as well as long-term fellowships from the Huntington Library, the Newberry Library, and the Library of Congress. Her course offerings include U.S. military affairs to 1900, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, Native American ethnohistory, and the first half of the Survey in American History. We are so honored to have you with us tonight, Dr. Franklin. I'll turn the program over to you. When you're ready for audience questions, please check back in with me. And again, for the audience, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Claire. And thank you to the audience for coming here virtually, remotely, digitally, Zoomly, to listen to what I have to say today. As a college professor, I must say in the last month or so, I've had enough of Zoom, but I'm quite excited to speak to you tonight. And I very, very much wish that I could have come out to Colorado, given the strange circumstances we all find ourselves in. But for a moment, we can escape from the present and return to the days of yesteryear in the 19th century past. For decades, the story of the Indian Wars has fascinated journalists, yarn spinners, and even a few historians of the American West. The mystery of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's death, the lives of Tatanka Ayatanka, Sitting Bull, and Tashanka Whitko, Crazy Horse, and the catastrophe of Wounded Knee have been too powerful for most writers to resist. The stories write themselves. Yet buried away at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. is a different story, one in which Army officers speak about law, order, and Indian rights. In tonight's talk, I'll explore the misguided notion of the so-called Indian Wars, the forgotten peers of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and the reasons why Custer still looms large in popular memory. We know the era of Custer and Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse by a familiar term, the Indian Wars. In these wars, Indigenous peoples are foils for the United States Army and the United States as a whole. They're reduced to two-dimensional characters whose function is to fight and die. But Indigenous people are real human beings. Their 19th century ancestors, Minikoju warriors, Kiowa women, they were real human beings. They were historical actors with a purpose of their own, rather than just extras in a B-grade movie Western, to which they have so often and so unfairly been reduced. It's my goal to tell a different kind of story about the American West, and to demolish the idea of the Indian Wars in the process. What's wrong with the idea of the Indian Wars? To speak of the Indian Wars imposes a structure that distorts our understanding of the past. We think of an unending series of conflicts instead of periods of uneasy peace and intermittent violence that led to instances of sustained violence and incidents of mass murder. We lose sight of a number of things when referring to the Indian Wars. We embrace a false sense of continuity in which one collision leads inevitably to the next, where, for instance, the Battle of Little Bighorn and the murder of Tituan, you know them as Lakota or Sioux people at Wounded Knee, are somehow connected. To this day, the idea persists in some quarters that soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment murdered women and children and elders at Wounded Knee as an act of revenge for Custer's death. But this idea is nonsense. It's patently false. Custer's soldiers died with him on a hilltop in 1876. None of those men survived to take part in the killings at Wounded Knee Creek in the winter of 1890. Even if officers of the regiment were present at the battle and the massacre alike, the obvious question presents itself. Why would they have waited 14 years to act? Second, to use the phrase, the Indian Wars, robs Indigenous communities of their distinctiveness and their incredible power. In fact, a couple of years ago, an overview of the Indian Wars written for the popular market did just that. It relied on the premise that intertribal warfare and factionalism, fighting, squabbling, bickering, kept Native peoples from uniting against a common enemy. And the author, unfortunately, perpetuated the idea that there were no tribal differences worth mentioning, no language barriers, no complicated political realities, none of the complex histories that define Indigenous people today. This sort of history is not really history. It's essentialism, and it has no basis, in fact. Likewise, when we talk about the Indian Wars, we give the stage to Ayatanka and Tashanka Whitko. We lose sight of the importance of American Horse, the 8th year of his horses, Pawnee Killer, and other principal men who are today little remembered outside their own communities. These men helped shape the Tituan Nation in the 1860s and 1870s. We speak of war chiefs and peace chiefs and rely on a vocabulary of factionalism that doesn't reflect the difficult decisions made by 19th century Native communities every day. And by the way, why do I say Tituan? That is the name of that people. Lakota is the name of their language. We've been misnaming them all along. Most importantly, to talk of the Indian Wars distracts us from uncomfortable truths. The past is not really past. It affects people in the here and now. It affects my friend who's from Cherry Creek, South Dakota, a Minikoju man who has lived that life every day for the last 50 odd years. More than anything else, the notion of the Indian Wars is responsible for perpetuating damaging stereotypes about Indigenous peoples. The Indian Wars were not just wars fought by equally matched combatants. The federal government perpetrated crimes against humanity, against Indigenous people. 19th century Army officers said so, and they were angry about it. Seeing massacres as exceptional or aberrant distracts us from the reality of anti-Indian hatred and its role in historic and ongoing violence against Indigenous peoples. The Army murdered Indians. Army officers and enlisted men indiscriminately killed men, women, and children. And Americans in the 19th century liked that. There is no disputing that fact. Given some of these uncomfortable truths, what I'm about to say next will probably take you by surprise. Contrary to popular belief, the United States Army did much more than fight Indians after the Civil War. It fed them to the tune of millions and millions of dollars worth of rations. It protected them under arms from Anglo-American civilians, and the Army even argued on their behalf. Few Army officers disagreed that Indians were an obstacle to territorial expansion in the West. They could fight Indians at the same time they asked for their just treatment, as one officer, John Pope, told General Ulysses S. Grant in 1865. Many Army officers questioned the efficiency and the morality of federal Indian policy, and a surprising number of them recognized that Native resistance was justified, and they offered quiet but generally consistent support for Native rights. In the West, soldiers outnumbered all other categories of federal employees combined. So as a result, when Native people spoke to white officials, they were conversing with Army officers as often as not. Transcripts of encounters between Army officers and Indigenous people show that, not surprisingly, Indigenous peoples are shrewd observers of events. But instead of consulting the Army's unpublished correspondence in the National Archives and Army officers' papers at research libraries across the country, most historians rely on the published documents. The unpublished letters, the ones that often don't make it into the books, with the exception of a few historians, tell a great deal about Army officers' daily contact with Native peoples and other residents of the West, their reactions to what the Army did on a day-to-day basis, and their ideas about Indian affairs. The evidence shows that fighting Indians was often the least of the Army's worries. Army officers didn't subscribe to a monolithic or sole set of ideas. While they were agents of an American empire, they didn't agree by the means by which the white West would replace a Native one. They answered to conflicting interests, supporting expansionist aims as often as they enforced treaties and the protection of Indian rights. Furthermore, the Army was not, and never has been, autonomous. That is, the Army doesn't make its own decisions. The military then is now controlled by the executive branch, answers to civilian authority, and is an instrument of Congress. The Army does not make its own policies. And those of us who have served, including myself, are aware of that. Because Army officers were subject to the demands of civilian officials and the public, they were hedged around by a host of logistical and bureaucratic boundaries in the 19th century that made all of them, even Lieutenant Colonel Custer, less effective. What circumstances made a constabulary force necessary in the West after the Civil War? Imagine a National Geographic map from high school, the one that plots out the annexation of Texas, the division of the Oregon Country, and the Mexican Cession of 1848. All these things enlarged the United States nearly to its present continental limits and brought the central grassland squarely into the middle of the country. By the end of the 1840s, the region and its residents lay squarely in the path of tens of thousands of gold seekers rushing to California. But the year 1849 wasn't just important because a flood of whites tramped across Indian country. That same year, the Office of Indian Affairs was transferred from the Department of War to the Department of the Interior. Since the establishment of the Office of Indian Affairs in 1834, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and his employees had always been civilians reporting to the Secretary of War. But the Army had been closely involved in Indian matters since the 18th century, and they continued to work among Indians and fight them until the end of the 19th century, and even into the early 20th century. Now, cynical people might suppose that the Army wanted the Indian Office and the War Department to facilitate pushing Indians around. But the same act that created the Office of Indian Affairs in 1834 gave the Army responsibility for feeding any Indians who showed up at military posts, whether as a gesture of hospitality, which has always been incredibly important to Native peoples, or to relieve genuine hunger. For instance, after a number of powerful Plains tribes signed a major treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, the Army became responsible for feeding thousands of Indians across the Plains. When Arapahoes, Cheyennes, and Tetuan agreed to move to Indian agencies where they would receive rations, food, and annuity goods, the Office of Indian Affairs took responsibility for them. Yet chronic delays and constant fraud and the exigencies of living on the plains meant that Indians were seldom fed according to plan. This meant then that Army officers often fed hungry Indian families out of their own regimental stores, even when those stores ran low and even when their own soldiers were hungry. Treaties had the effect of making Native peoples increasingly dependent on the federal government for their survival. Native people had no need for individual land ownership, as they then and now believe that land belongs to everyone in common, and in fact that the land is an entity to itself that exists alongside human beings, animals, and the natural world. The land is not something that can be kept or possessed. Neither were Native people interested, for the most part, in houses, plows, corn, and they were scarcely less interested in cows. But these were the things that the federal government wanted them to accept in exchange for rations and annuity goods. And giving white people the right of way in Indian country meant less access to hunting grounds and dwindling buffalo herds. When Native people signed treaties, they were often agreeing to things that were alien to them. Cultural misunderstanding, the inability to interpret another group's culture, occurred on both sides. And there's a great deal of current evidence to suggest that many treaties were deliberately mistranslated by interpreters working hand in hand with the federal government. So instead of focusing solely on conflict and war, we ought to examine the history of the American West as a history of entanglements, as Pekka Hemalainen of Oxford University has put it. He's the author of The Comanche Empire and the recent Lakota America, a very excellent book. The notion of the Indian Wars does not account for the intriguing things that Army officers had to say about Indians, such as, they recall the promises made and ask pertinently, who can they believe now? I have done all I could for these people. I have a real interest in them. I've witnessed their patience under starvation, their continued friendship under disappointment. There are Lakotas who will starve before lifting a hand against the whites. We must not treat them as children or brutes. We must meet them as men in an honest talk. And this, from William Tecumseh Sherman, the General-in-Chief of the Army himself. There are two classes of people, one demanding the utter extinction of the Indians, and the other full of love for their conversion to civilization and Christianity. Unfortunately, the Army stands between and gets the cuffs from both sides. Such sentiments might surprise the buffs, the people who live and breathe a very traditional version of the Indian Wars that makes heroes of Army officers and tends to make tragic foes of Native people. Let's consider some events associated with the so-called Indian Wars. Some of these may be familiar to you, some of them not. And I'm happy to recommend reading in terms of recent work done by my colleagues on these various events. In 1862, Santee or Santee or Eastern Dakota Indians living in Western Minnesota could not take any more abuse from white settlers who encroached on their land, or the federal government, which neglected to give them food as promised. In 1862, these people were literally starving to death. The Dakota Uprising, which should really be called the Minnesota War, was one in which Native peoples killed hundreds of white settlers. This led to the largest mass execution in American history at Mankato, Minnesota, on the site of the Mankato Public Library, which now stands there. 38 Asante men were convicted of murder and were hung from a massive gallows. This is, again, the largest mass execution in American history. And this is one of the very, very few instances in which Indigenous people struck out violently at large numbers of whites at once. Then there is the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where Colorado militiamen, volunteer troops from that territory, local troops, attacked a group of peaceful Cheyenne who had agreed not to fight the whites mere days before. These troops were led by Colonel John Shivington, a Civil War veteran and former Methodist minister who hoped to make a name for himself in Colorado politics by killing Indians. While the Cheyenne warriors were out hunting, the militia killed more than 150 women, children, and elders. Troops mutilated and killed Native peoples, and women's body parts and men's body parts were displayed in what was then known as the Denver Theater. The legend goes that local residents paid admission to see these ghastly souvenirs. Ill-informed people tend to conflate the volunteer and professional forces, but it's clear that many regular Army officers and other government authorities were very critical of the massacre. One Army officer, Major Edward Wynkoop, came to the defense of the Cheyenne people, and he resigned his commission in the Army when more Cheyenne were killed during the Ouachita Massacre, perpetrated by Custer in the 7th Cavalry in 1868. Wynkoop's colleague, Captain Silas Sewell, had been at the massacre, and he'd refused Shivington's orders to kill. Sewell would eventually be shot in the face, killed in broad daylight on the streets of Denver by a Colorado militiaman said to be loyal to Shivington. The so-called peace policy of President Ulysses S. Grant was meant in part to remedy the evils of Indian massacres. In his first inaugural address, delivered in March 1869, President Grant declared, "The proper treatment of the original occupants of this land, the Indians, deserve careful study. I will favor any course toward them which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship." Citizenship that was not granted to Native peoples until 1924 formally, and informally until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Grant's policy gave a number of church groups control of some Indian agencies. Other agencies continued to be managed by Army officers. Reformers had been clamoring to take control of Indian affairs, believing they were more honest than the Army. This was not necessarily the case. Corruption was rampant in Indian affairs. It's no wonder that Mel Brooks joked about it in Blazing Saddles. A great deal of federal money was being spent without much supervision, which gave unscrupulous Indian agents the opportunity to line their pockets, and line their pockets they did. In contrast, Army officers would lose their commissions and pensions if they were found guilty of graft or corruption. They would also lose the respect of their colleagues. This tended to keep them honest. Did the peace policy lead to peace throughout the West? No. In the winter of 1870, one Army regiment swept down on a Piegan Indian village in Montana and slaughtered 173 men, women, children, and elders. The major in command happened to be roaring drunk at the time. Humanitarians, mocked as Indian lovers, were horrified. Westerners, by and large, wished that more Indians had been killed. Some Army officers objected angrily to these kinds of killings, for massacres made it difficult to keep the peace. Westward expansion made native-white conflict seem almost inevitable. In 1871, the Northern Pacific Railroad had reached Minnesota. Railroad engineers began to survey lands in modern-day North Dakota. The planned route of the rail line would reach through Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington state, right through the middle of Indian country. As a result, Indigenous people attacked railroad builders. They tore up railroad tracks and destroyed locomotives. One Teton warrior named Spotted Eagle told an Army officer in 1872 that he would tear up the railroad and kill its builders, for the driving off of the buffalo meant death to his people. The Army officer took him at his word. Despite the efforts of Native leaders to restrain young warriors and their own contemporaries, raiding and occasional warfare remained central features of Indigenous life on the plains. Why? Well, survival is difficult when you live outside in the elements every day of the year. Anglo-Americans, almost always primed for violence west of the Mississippi, were quick to demand retribution when Native people struck their homes and ranches. This is particularly true in central and west and northern Texas after the Civil War. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, settlers lived on isolated homesteads that afforded them little protection from Indian raids. This meant that Kiowa and Comanche warriors could thunder down to Texas, steal free grazing cattle by the thousands, and sell them to traders in New Mexico in exchange for weapons, ammunition, cloth, metal goods, beads, and other necessities. Texans remained stubbornly ignorant, for the most part, of complex Indigenous and Mexican trade networks, many of which had existed in some form or another since the 17th century. Unwilling to see Indians as anything other than savage miscreants, and savage miscreants is a quote from a 19th century source, Texans refused to listen when army officers pointed out that not all of the thieves in Texas were Indigenous. In fact, many were white outlaws who disguised themselves in the garb of Indians. And we have a great deal of proof from that for this from army officers at Fort Sill. On the one hand, civilians clamored for military intervention throughout the West. On the other hand, they claimed that their own local militias, local volunteer troops, were better at fighting Native people than regular troops. Army officers tended to find this highly insulting. In Reconstruction-era Texas, Southerners complained about Union men and local authorities who sought to control them. This is hardly surprising, given the fact that many Texans refused to abide by federal mandates after the Civil War. In the mid-1860s, hundreds of African Americans, if not up to 1,000, were the object of Texans' anger, and they were the victims of lynching and other brutal crimes. A couple of years later, Native people were blamed for post-war problems in the territory. It's important to remember that relying on the trope, the idea of the Indian Wars, distorts Indigenous history as well. Take the common idea that Indigenous people have so-called traditional enemies. For instance, warriors from the Crow tribe, their own name for themselves is Apsaluka, frequently served as scouts for the army, and this gave rise to the notion that there's a long-standing hatred between Crows and Tidawan. But Indigenous societies are fluid and dynamic, meaning that, as often as not, Crows and Tidawan people could be allies. Friendly relations were encouraged by the fact that Apsaluka and Tidawan people intermarried. The Crow leader sits in the middle of the land, was the brother-in-law of the Tidawan leader, they fear even his horses. At a major council in the late 1860s, another Crow leader named Bearstooth made this fascinating assertion in front of federal officials. The Tidawan have given me a great many hundreds of horses and mules to join them in fighting you. If they told us that you were going to fool us and not give us back your country, and that you would play the same trick on us that you played on them. The Tidawan prediction came true. The same sort of misunderstanding persists when it comes to the relative importance of Native leaders. Most people have heard of Sitting Bull, Ayatanka Tatanka, and Crazy Horse, Tashanka Whitcomb. But only a small number of people will recognize the name of They Fear Even His Horses, often mistranslated in the past as His Horses Are Afraid of Him, which doesn't make sense for a gentleman on the plains. Then there's American Horse, Red Dog, He Dog, Pawnee Killer, Spotted Eagle, High Bear, and others. They Fear Even His Horses, American Horse, and Red Dog were important, but because they generally took on the roles of cultural intermediaries, or were assigned those roles by Anglo-American leaders, they have been forgotten by the general public in favor of their ostensibly militant peers. Any of these men were known as Itashas in the Lakota language. They were symbolic fathers. They led their communities. They Fear Even His Horses, an American Horse, like Crazy Horse, were shirt wearers. They held a position of the highest and most influential status. They wore what are sometimes called power shirts, Buckskin shirts decorated with porcupine quill work, bead designs, fringes, and locks of hair. The hair, whether given to the wearer by a family member or taken from an enemy's head, or the mane or tail of a favorite horse, was an embodiment of personal honor. Painted designs also contribute to the breathtaking beauty of these garments, carefully selected by the maker, which were not only warriors, but the warriors' wives, sisters, aunts, nieces, and grandmothers. The details not only complement the shirt's appearance, but refer to cultural ideas and stories. Spiritual power, often referred to colloquially as medicine, was a part of these shirts as well. Plains Indigenous societies in the 19th century, and many individuals today, believe that this force comes from various sources: profound spirituality, extraordinary strength or physical ability, excellent service as a warrior, brilliant leadership, a close interaction with Tankashila, the grandfathers, or Wakantanka, the great mystery, as that entity has sometimes been called, or force, or any of these sources combined. To borrow a quote from Obi-Wan Kenobi, think of medicine as the force, an energy field created by all living things that surrounds us and penetrates us, that binds the galaxy together. Native leaders base their political decisions on practical considerations and spiritual beliefs and events, such as visions. Spiritual power accounts for more Native history than the average non-Indigenous person is aware. Shirt wearers were well aware of the power of the United States, and they sought to negotiate with federal authorities because they realized that the very survival of their people depended on accommodating white interests and not war. Other Tidawan disagreed, particularly those communities which had tended to live north of rail lines and white settlers. Rather than settle on large reservations after 1868, and even earlier, they had moved further north to the Powder River country in southeastern Montana. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were among the many Tidawan people who took refuge there. Red Dog saw things differently. He had this to say about his northern relatives: they are looking for trouble, and they will find it. In 1872, he told other Tidawan leaders about his journey through the plains, which were then dominated by whites. I've traveled over a great country. The white man was everywhere. I saw many Indians. Those I spoke to, they were glad to see me. Look at me. My face is like yours, but I'm no longer Tidawan. I am a Wasichu, a white man. My heart is like the Wasichus. I want to have my people live and be happy. There's no use thinking of trouble with the Wasichus. The Great Father has a great many soldiers. I see them on the railroad to Salt Lake. I see them in Montana and all along the Missouri River. Our country is surrounded with them. Listen to me and they will never come to you. We must think of our old people and take care of them. We must raise our children in the ways of the whites. Then they will live. We must act together for the good of all our people. Middle-aged leaders such as Red Dog faced a terrible dilemma after the Civil War. When they were young, they were able to fight and steal horses and accrue honor and status. Now younger men wanted to go out and do the same. But Anglo-American encroachment posed unique problems for Native people on the plains. On the one hand, Native people regarded these newcomers in much the same way as they did their Indigenous rivals. Whether Crow, Pawnee, Blackfoot, or white, other groups represented a threat to Tidawan control of the plains. On the other hand, Anglo-Americans were powerful, and mysteriously so, as any chief who visited Washington, D.C. could attest. When the Itashas, the principal leaders, signed treaties with the federal government, there were provisions that invariably required them to restrain young men and their own contemporaries who wanted to attack white people. But doing so, for a variety of social and political reasons, was next to impossible. Young people had a powerful incentive to leave reservations and prove their worth. Young men had a powerful need to do so by martial deeds. And sometimes young women committed martial deeds as well. They fought as women warriors. Young men might never acquire the status of their elders and risk the ridicule of their peers if they didn't go out and fight. Such tensions led warriors to insult others unwilling to take up arms by calling them, a common insult of the day, old women who dared not fight the whites. Despite this complex situation, Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull have been generally depicted as militant and ready for war. Did Crazy Horse resoundingly reject diplomatic accords with the United States, as one historian has suggested? No, not at all. As late as April 1875, roughly 1 year before he participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Crazy Horse was willing to accept any treaty made by his southern relatives who were living on the reservations. Why? Well, hunger is a powerful motivator. That fall, an unexpected turn of events allowed Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull to distance themselves from the agencies and diplomatic overtures from their own relatives and the federal government. The buffalo herds had suddenly returned to the Powder River country. By the spring of 1876, chronic mismanagement of Indian affairs caused thousands of Tidawan people and others to leave the Indian agencies and to flock north to join their relatives. On June 24th, 1876, Tidawans led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, along with Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, pitched their lodges on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. The United States, as one historian has put it, would launch a sustained and ultimately successful campaign against Tidawan, who had steadfastly rejected agency life. And what about Custer? Was he anything like the army officer who spoke of law, orders, and Indian rights? Well, Custer had always been a little bit reckless. On June 25th, 1876, he and his regiment forged ahead, charging toward 10,000 Indian women, men, and children without waiting for the other regiments to catch up. Custer was killed along with 262 of his men. In recent decades, Custer's been portrayed most often as an Indian hater, so to speak. But in his own time, even he recognized that Tidawan discontent was justified. In 1875, he wrote, "The Indians at Standing Rock Agency are not without just cause of complaint. Those people had been receiving only half of their food ration during the winter, a food ration that was fairly paltry to begin with. Food sat in warehouses in Midwestern cities rather than being shipped to Indian agencies, so Indians went hungry." Unlike some of his colleagues, Custer had seldom worked closely with Indigenous people, which made him far less apt to develop any real or lasting concern for them. But Custer is the name that everyone knows. His actions shape our collective memory. Even specialists in the field of Western history would be hard-pressed to recognize the name of Army officers such as David Sloan Stanley or Pinckney Luganville. Like the notion of the Indian Wars, Custer distorts the ways in which we understand history. At the Little Bighorn, Custer had not expected the Tidawan and their allies to gather by the thousands. He was taken by surprise, and all of the members of his regiment who were with him were killed. Nearly a century and a half later, his name still evokes a sense of mystery. The Little Bighorn Associates, a collection of very serious buffs, makes their position clear. They are dedicated to seeking the truth, so says their mission statement, about Custer. To this end, they have a thriving message board online, and at least they used to have an annual conference that was once quite well attended. Seeking the truth? Isn't it obvious? One of Custer's biographers offers the following explanation. She writes, "There's a genuine mystery here behind the spurious one of what happened on the Little Bighorn battlefield. The mystery of white America's collective refusal to accept the obvious explanation. White Americans have clung to the supposed mystery of the last stand as a way of continuing their allegiance to the stubbornly rooted belief that whites could always outfight Indians. Case in point, a few years ago, a politician accused a state governor of having, quote, disrespected Colonel Custer, unquote, by meeting with Indigenous leaders. What are we to make of such attitudes? Simply put, outdated ideas about Indigenous peoples, the Army, and the American West still persist. But if we actively seek to create a history of entanglements, rather than a narrative that offers a neat denouement or ending, we will be better off for having embraced a version of the past that is messy, contradictory, and complex. Thank you. I realize that we finished a bit early. I'm willing to entertain questions after maybe about a 5-minute break.
Okay, you need to take a quick break?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to remain on this link, or do you want me to use the one that Chris had sent me?
No, we're going to stay on this link so that the general audience can ask questions.
Okay, great. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes.
Okay. While we're waiting for Dr. Franklin, I just wanted to put in a plug for a couple of programs that we have coming up. Coming up on Thursday night, it's kind of unusual, but we do have 2 programs this week. We have Cindy Dale joining us on Thursday evening, October 1st, also at 6 p.m. And this is going to be a program on the different types of light. It's part of our consciousness series. And then on next Thursday, October 8th, we have a program that's going to examine Proposition 114. This is the ballot proposition of the reintroduction of the gray wolf to Colorado. And we're really honored to have 2 people on different sides of this issue joining us. One of them is wildlife biologist and Montana State Senator Mike Phillips. He's going to be joined by Farm Bureau Vice President Sean Martini. Sean had an article in the Denver Post, if you're a subscriber to the Denver Post, just this past weekend, laying out the case against this ballot proposition, and we'll have Rob Levine moderating that program. And then on the 22nd, we have what we thought was going to be our final program of the season. It's our State of the Valley that we do with the Vail Valley Partnership. And just a note on that program, it's one of our rare morning programs, and that will take place from 9 until 10 a.m. on October 22nd. And then we have a very special program that we're very excited about. It's kind of a pop-up program that we're going to be offering on November 11th. This will be a Wednesday, and it's widely known as Veterans Day. Not as widely known is the fact that that day will be the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower at Plymouth. And we have a historian from the Hudson Institute, Melanie Kirkpatrick, joining us. She's written a book on the history of Thanksgiving, both the holiday itself, but also how it came to be a federal holiday, which didn't take place until the middle of the 19th century. So it's going to be a very interesting program. It will wrap up our summer season. I know we're well into fall now, but that will wrap up our summer season. And we're already well at work on our winter season. One of the programs we're very excited about is a program on the future of higher education. And joining us for that program is the current president of Penn State, Dr. Barron, and the past president of Yale, as well as he ran the online program Coursera, which is an online education program, Rick Levin. So that program is going to be coming up on January 7th. Very excited about that program. Another program that we have coming up in December, we're inviting Peter Pomerezev. The name may not ring a bell with you, but he has written extensively on Russian disinformation campaigns. So that program is going to be happening in December. Another program will happen in the winter season is a program that is actually a movie. It's out now. And in fact, one of the things we're going to suggest is that people watch it in advance. It's called Kiss the Ground. And this is a documentary. It's an environmental documentary. And unlike a lot of the environmental documentaries, this one is actually pretty upbeat because it gives some really interesting things we can do to start sequestering carbon dioxide in our soils through regenerative farming. So that's a program we'll have coming up this winter. We haven't set a date with that, but in addition to the movie, we'll have several of the filmmakers doing a Q&A through our webinar format. We will be presenting our winter season on our webinar format through April, and then we'll just have to see how things go for whether or not we change our format back to our normal in-person programs in the summer. The other thing I wanted to put in a plug for is the fact that because we're doing the webinar format, we're able to film all of these, to record all of these. So all of these programs are on the videos and presentations tab on our website. So you can go there, and if you've missed one, or if you want to go back and check on something, you can go to our website and check that. And I also wanted to put in a plug for donating, if you're not already donating to the Vail Symposium, to visit vailsymposium.org. We'll just give Dr. Franklin another moment, and we'll, oh, here she is. Dr. Franklin, in your absence, we've gotten a ton of questions. I'm gonna start with Judy's question, which is, which Indigenous community was most successful in negotiating with the military or the government and its Indigenous neighbors, and why?
Most successful at negotiating. That depends on what sort of negotiation we mean. Negotiating for rations and annuities might be one thing. Negotiating for cessation of hostilities might be another. It's important to remember that negotiation was only one strategy that Native peoples used. Diplomacy, trade, tribute, coercion, a variety of strategies were used throughout the 19th century, 18th century even, by Indigenous peoples across the country to get what they wanted from others, whether the federal government or not. You might say, you might judge the success of a Native community's negotiation by their survivance, as the scholar Gerald Bisnor put it, the term survivance, meaning their matched survival and resistance. You might say that the Crows and the Pawnees were successful because they were able, in some senses, to partner as scouts with the United States Army and evade some of the more heavy-handed tactics. You might say that by their own measure, the Comanches and the Tetawan were incredibly successful at negotiating because they held out until the late 1870s or later. The Nez Perce, Chief Joseph's people, in their own way, were adept at negotiating right up until 1877. So it simply depends on what community you're talking about and what you might mean by negotiation. But that's a great, interesting question.
Before we move on to another question, I did just want to clarify something. How are we to refer to Native Americans? Is it Native American? Is it Indian? Is it Indigenous peoples?
It depends on who you talk to. First and foremost, my own friends prefer to be called by the name of the community they belong to. So my friend, Dr. Patty Jo King, retired as Director of Native American Studies at the Indian College, Bighorn College, prefers to be called Cherokee, or in their own language, Slagi. My friend Billy Joe Kingfisher prefers to be called Minikoju, because that is the Sioux, i.e. Teton subtribe to which he belongs. So if you ever go to an academic or other conference, you'll often see that Native people are referred to by their home community in parentheses. That's the most appropriate way to address them. There are people who prefer to be called Indigenous. There are people who prefer to be called Native with a capital N. There are Indigenous people who don't mind being called Indian. But we're all aware that there are a number of terms, such as the name of a former name of a football team, which are absolutely unacceptable and yet have had longstanding currency in this country for decades. So really specificity and respect is the most important thing when it comes to talking about our Indigenous neighbors and friends.
Cheryl just mentioned in the chat that in Canada, they refer to their Indigenous people as First Nations.
Yes.
So Doris and another questioner has asked about where you got your information and how you got access to it.
The Army's unpublished manuscript correspondence, meaning letters on paper that date back to the 1860s, are housed in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Sadly, the archives has been closed, along with the Library of Congress and some other institutions, since the beginning of the pandemic. But the Army has tens of thousands of linear feet of records sitting in Washington, and a linear foot of records is literally measured by how many pieces of paper you can fit into a linear foot. So the Army's unpublished manuscript correspondence is vast. Part of it is reproduced as a result of 19th century Army record keeping on microfilm in what's called the Adjutant General's Office, letters received and letters sent. But the really interesting stuff is on paper in the National Archives. It hasn't been digitized. It's not elsewhere available. Army officers' papers are at places like the Minnesota Historical Society, the Montana Historical Society, Bowdoin College. Library of Congress has the papers of Sheridan and Sherman, which your audience may be interested to know are now fully digitized. They're not searchable, but the actual paper letters, Sherman's terrible handwriting, are available for you to actually see. The challenge with the National Archives in writing this book has been that, as anybody who's gone to DC knows, staying there isn't cheap. And I have been fortunate throughout graduate school and as a scholar to be able to camp out in DC for days at a time, put in 10-hour days at the archives and come home with lots of information. And as far as Indigenous sources go, again, those are available at repositories throughout the West. The Beinecke Library at Yale, the Newberry Library, the Huntington Library have tremendous collections of Western Americana. And the most critical part of the book is my ability to connect with Native friends and members of the community and scholars who can confirm whether what I'm saying is correct or incorrect.
Quick question from Carol Sebron. She would like to know how accurate or your assessment of the book Custer and Crazy Horse by Stephen Ambrose.
That is not a book that I happen to be familiar with. If you ask certain historians in certain quarters, they are not necessarily complimentary of Ambrose's work. Unfortunately, he was one of a number of historians who his work has fallen into disfavor among some academic circles in the last several years. I can, on the other hand, highly recommend the work of Robert M. Utley, who is the preeminent military historian of the West. His books are titled Frontiersmen in Blue, Frontier Regulars. He's done biographies of Sitting Bull, Billy the Kid, I think. His most recent book is really excellent, a nice little book called The Commanders. Paul Hutton, of course, a great biography of Phil Sheridan. Robert Wister, Sherry Smith, who other than myself is really the lone woman who's done Western military history. So there's a lot of readable, great academic scholarship out there. National Parks historians, friends of mine, Paul Hedron, Eli Paul, John Monnet, they've all done excellent, approachable work. Jerry Green has done fantastic stuff on a number of conflicts. There's all kinds of great stuff out there.
Well, Heather has a question that's sort of a variation of what you're just talking about. She's wondering if there are any books or videos that you could recommend for younger people, for people in elementary school, high school, on Custer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse.
I believe the title of the book is Saga of the Sioux, and it's actually a young adult version of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Dee Brown's old book, which is now a little bit on the obsolete side. But there are certainly things available for young people to read. In terms of literature on Indigenous people, an artist, educator, and writer named Paul Goble, G-O-B-L-E, back in the 70s and 80s did a fabulous series of children's picture books, which are also intended for adults, that tell Indigenous stories. And they have some of the most beautiful horse art and art in general that you've ever seen. So there's lots of really fantastic resources on Native people available for a young or juvenile or children's audience.
We have another question, again, that I think relates to this. And the questioner is asking what role Hollywood played in perpetuating myths about Indigenous people. And do historians see any progress being made in stories that are more accurate, that are really in popular culture?
Hollywood bears a large part of the blame for the really devastating stereotypes that have been handed out about Indigenous people. And when I say devastating, if you get to talking to Native people and you ask them how their children have been treated in elementary school and middle school and junior high, the things that you hear can be very upsetting and disturbing. Children are not necessarily nice to each other at that age. And if you are a young Indigenous man who wears your hair in braids, that sort of thing is not modern, and it's difficult for young people and even adults today to understand. Hollywood has certainly, with any John Wayne movie you can think of, perpetuated all kinds of stereotypes. Just last night, my husband and I watched The Outlaw Josey Wales, fantastic Clint Eastwood movie. And the Native man who has the starring role in that, Chief Dan George, is a Pacific Coast Salish man who plays the role of a Cherokee. There are Native people in that film, and Clint Eastwood made a, I think, sterling effort to show that Native people are real human beings. But there are a great many movies dating back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s that make Native people out to be villains. One groundbreaking film at the time that tried to reverse the narrative is Soldier Blue with Peter Fonda and Candice Bergen. And what that film essentially did was impose the Vietnam War on the American West. And that movie did not do Native peoples any favors. Black Robe is a really fascinating film about the Jesuits and Native peoples in the 16th century. But the movie that's forever and will always own my heart is Dances with Wolves, which I happened to see when I was 9 years old. And I jokingly say to audiences, but not entirely jokingly, that film is part of the reason that I do what I do, because it opened the world of history to me in a very visceral, enthralling way. Recently, there have been some Hollywood films such as Hostiles that have tried to give a more even-handed picture of the American West. But then again, you have Flotsam and Jetsam, like the Johnny Depp Lone Ranger film, which not intentionally reinforces, again, damaging stereotypes about Native people. So that's the Hollywood part of the question. Remind me what the second component was?
Well, what historians, how historians are viewing this and how they're perhaps addressing it.
The number of people doing Western military history is dwindling. There is decreased academic interest in the field for a variety of reasons. There are a number of early career scholars, such as myself, working on it. However, our best historians are either in their 80s, like Robert Utley, or are about to retire, like Robert Worcester, or are retired, as Sherry Smith is. So those of my colleagues are still on the conference circuit and they're still writing, but eventually the mantle is going to have to fall to a very small number of people who are interested in this field. And although popular writers, such as Nathaniel Philbrick, have done really readable, entertaining work, it doesn't necessarily dig into the complexities that the manuscript correspondence of the National Archives presents. I'm not exactly sure that audiences are quite ready for the sort of story that I'm trying to tell.
So last question, because we're out of time, comes from Dangler, and he's asking what percentage of history, this particular history of Native Americans, is actually written by Native Americans?
Very little. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, Native people have, as have other minority groups in the United States, suffered from substandard education over the last 50, 60, 70 years. To go to graduate school to get a degree in history is expensive. To try to find a job afterward is equally expensive. And most Native people tend to gravitate toward fields that their communities need: law, legal justice, healthcare. There is a small and very active number of Native scholars writing Native history. Billy Joe Kingfisher, my friend who writes on public policy in the 1930s, fantastic 19th century work has been done by Leo Kilsback, who's Northern Cheyenne, and he's now at Montana State Bozeman. My Cherokee friend, Patty Jo King. Josh Reed, who I believe is part Indigenous. Jeffrey Means, another friend of mine at University of Wyoming. There are a number of Native women. Jennifer Nez Dennetdale, now retired, but famous Diné Navajo scholar, one of the first Navajo women to get a PhD in American history and American studies. So there are a number of Native people producing academic histories. There are also a tremendous number of community historians within the Indigenous community who are writing histories for their own people. Sadly, those histories have not yet reached the popular audience.
Dr. Franklin, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I want to thank our audience as well for joining us this evening. I hope they'll join us later on this week. Again, Dr. Franklin, thank you very much, and I hope you'll join us for the post-event discussion that Chris sent you a link for.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.